For Kenya, COVID-19 in itself has had quite a positive impact when it comes to climate change and environment conservation altogether. All right, Joseph, just to pause it there, we seem to have a problem getting through to Joseph. But as we rectify that, Doreen, let's talk about the assessment of the state of the environment in the wake of coronavirus. We've seen satellite images showing countries like China and the amount of pollution that was literally reduced by the containment measures, curfews, to contain COVID-19. How has the environment changed since coronavirus?
So the changes we've seen in the environment show us what's possible for the future, but these are not wins. The human life loss and the destruction on the planet is really what we're focused on. But at the same time, when we see clean air, when we see the potential of wildlife returning to places that it wasn't before, we know that if we do things differently, that we could possibly recover the health of our planet. And so that's what we're pushing for on World Environment Day. I
understand Joseph is back. Joseph, the year 2020 in itself began with the environmental crisis revealing themselves in a disturbing manner. Wildfires were damaging parts of Australia. We had cyclones, rainforests, bushfires all across the world, really. Talk to us about this theme of biodiversity and its importance in this year's World Environment Day.
Yeah, that exposes the nexus, the link between the impacts of climate change to biodiversity. It tells us that we have to care for environment in an inclusive manner. That if we don't address the climate change in a comprehensive manner, it is going to affect the biodiversity. And you see what we are seeing even in this coronavirus and other crises you are seeing, they have direct link to the environment which we live on. Talking about the COVID-19 and other crises, you realize that there is direct link between these crises. The virus itself has a link from a wet market, from one. And when you look into that, then you realize that it is the environment. You go to disturb the habitat for animals. And once that happens, then that disease, the so-called zoonotic diseases, which are transferred from animals, go and disturb their habitat. So the diseases are transferred to animals. And so what we are seeing is more and more as we interfere with nature, the nature pays back, as you have heard the UN Secretary General talking about.
Even in the wake of COVID-19, Joseph, we've seen floods in Kenya kill more people than the coronavirus itself. Again, magnifying the importance of not just the conservation, but biodiversity in itself. In an age where so many species are facing extinction right now, how do we go about respecting biodiversity and implementing it in our climate change policies?
Yeah, actually that's the crux of the matter. How do we really live in interdependence with nature? That's the most important thing. You have mentioned rightly, we lost so many people in floods. You have mentioned Australia and those others where people have been swept. So these are impacts of climate change, which we are not even talking about. We have the COVID-19 is a very rapid, phenomenon. But now, when you look at it, is the climate change, for instance, is another a crisis, but which is not so rapid, but it's affecting people. Those are the impacts, the floods and those others are the impacts of climate change. Biodiversity loss are impacts of climate change. So the question is, how are we going to address them in a more coordinated, a more simultaneous manner without forgetting that they have a relationship with each other? So this is what we need to do. I know our country, for instance, has the best climate change policy. It has the best climate change law. The best biodiversity law. But now, when we come to the implementation of these laws, then that is where really we go wrong. So,
I mean,
one thing.
We've had this conversation even on a global, scale with the several climate summits being held. Doreen, if there's anything we've learned from COVID-19 is that we have a direct impact in conservation of the environment. I mean, the amount of pollution that has been reversed simply by people staying home longer has been quite apparent. But how do we implement this moving forward in our policies in different countries across the world?
So two main things. First, we know with zoonotic diseases that the way humans behave affects how these diseases emerge, and it affects how they're transmitted. It also affects our ability to cope. If we have unhealthy people living in polluted environments, they don't do well with respiratory diseases. So we have to, first and foremost, look and understand how our behaviors interact with the natural world. We need to understand that better, and we need to get more prepared. In terms of how we can predict the next outbreaks, but also what we can do to mitigate them. But I think this year and this COVID and the wildfires, it is a wake-up call from the planet, telling us that we need to change and do something differently. So even though you mentioned the climate conference, the post-2020 biodiversity conference has been delayed, but the work is still going on. And now more than ever, we need policymakers to commit to make sure that the environmental aspects of our sustainable future are included, and we make those commitments to change now, because the pathways we were on before the COVID crisis were not sustainable for the planet, and they weren't healthy for us as human beings.
Let's talk about the UN Climate Summit, COP26, that was to take place in Glasgow. That has been postponed now. But what are some of the emerging global concerns that are to be discussed in this summit?
Yeah, well, first and foremost, we're not making enough progress. We're seeing countries around the world who are trying to ramp up their commitments to stop greenhouse gases emission, and so we can't lose sight of the fact that we still need to do that, because this crisis is still will still be around after COVID, and it will make it harder for us to respond to future pandemics. So we've got to keep up that commitment. We've got to find new ways to invest in our infrastructure that work with nature, not against nature. Nature can provide the solutions. We just have to work with it.
Joseph, let's bring you in terms of financing and the priority on financing climate change mitigation measures as a country. I mean, President Uhuru Kenyatta himself has been quite active in ensuring and championing a green economy. But how has the financing been since 2013?
Well, as a signatory to the Climate Change Convention and the Paris Agreement, the Kenya, as any other developing country, owes to get sufficient resources. That is money from developed countries, as by the convention, to implement some of its actions under what they call the nationally determined contributions, the actions which countries which have committed to reduce emissions and build resilience to communities like the floods which you saw in the Rift Valley. But now we have a problem. We have competing priorities in a country like us. And the question now, like the example of this, when we are in the era of COVID-19, the challenge for the government is whether to take that money, which is going to the health, to address urgent health issues, to take it to environment. So more or less what happens to the government is that climate change, environmental issues are not taken as so much priority than these other issues, whereas it should be the opposite, because it is within that, in the environment, that we build life. And so if, until we are able to prioritize environmental challenges like this, climate change, biodiversity, we are going to be experiencing such challenges which we are experiencing now. And so what we are calling upon the government is, as you prioritize other issues, you have to acknowledge that in order to attain sustainable development, for President Kenyatta to achieve is ambitious Agenda 2030 and oral agenda, the Big Four agenda. That cannot be achieved without addressing climate issues, because once those floods comes, once the drought comes, all the gains which have been achieved are going to be wiped away. That's what it means. But we are not able to link how these challenges, climate-related impacts, will impact on the ambitious plans which they have, whether on the shorter term or longer term.
Right. Doreen, in the spirit of this year's theme of biodiversity, you mentioned earlier, I mean, when the rate of pollution is high, then respiratory illnesses are on the rise. When there's viruses like coronavirus, then a larger population is affected by this virus. In the same breath, to prevent future pandemics, it is rather important to bridge the human-animal health divide. Let's talk about how wildlife biologists and professionals like yourself come in here as an untapped resource, because we're speaking about biodiversity. Humans must be taken care of, animals too must be taken care of.
Yeah, so zoonotic diseases are the ones that jump between humans and animals, and so we have to be monitoring the animals. There's numbers of wildlife biologists on the ground. They are eyes and ears. They are aware of what's going on with wildlife. They can see when diseases are emerging. So by monitoring wildlife health, we have a sense of where these diseases might be emerging. But also, our interactions with wildlife are important to monitor. When we get too close to wildlife because of encroachment, because of different reasons, the chance for these diseases to emerge actually increases. So we've got to understand the diseases better. We've got to break down those silos between the animal, human, and wildlife health dimensions so that we can get better prepared and understand how these mechanisms work in the future.
All right, so many thanks for your time. That is Doreen Robinson. She is the UN's Global Chief for Wildlife at the United Nations Environment Program, UNEP, live with us in studio. Also with us in this conversation, Joseph Mithika Mwenda, who is the Executive Director of the Pan-African Justice Alliance, PACJA, joining us live via Zoom all the way from Meru. Many thanks for your time, ladies and gentlemen. Let's take a short break here on Bottom Line Africa. More news still to come. Let's leave you with Destination Africa.